Okay, so my name is Avery Alder Mcdaldno. I'm going to be talking today about aiming for sincere emotional experiences in games. I'm going to be talking about some of the pitfalls that we tend to encounter when we start trying to design for or play for that experience. And I'm going to talk about a couple games. I'm going to talk about two of my games and one of a friend's games. And then afterwards, there's going to be probably a bunch of time for questions. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm going to be talking about story games, or like tabletop role-playing games. Let's try to cover that bit. So first, a quick introduction. My name is Avery Alder Mcdaldno. I make games. I've been making it since 2006. I tend to kind of return to the same themes over and over, again in different configurations. My games tend to be about kind of exploring emotional states rather than certain plots or certain kind of genre trappings necessarily. My games tend to be very emotion-leading and emotion-centered. They tend to explore communities, whether that's in the case of a game like Monster Hearts, like a kind of small microcosm of police in a high school, or whether that's like in The Quiet Year or Dream Askew, a post-apocalyptic community, but usually about small communities and how they hold together or don't. In Apocalypse. So I've got there pictures from three of the games that I've worked on. That's Monster Hearts. Have people here played Monster Hearts? A bunch of people, cool. Monster Hearts is a game about teenage monsters. It's a game about going through puberty and going through learning how to kind of assert yourself and claim your agency in the world, and also like how being a werewolf kind of sucks, or being a vampire kind of sucks. The Quiet Year is a game about a post-apocalyptic community, and rather than telling a story about kind of the rugged, individualistic, lifted up by their bootstraps individuals who survive, we focus on a community and its wants and needs and a landscape. And so it's like a post-apocalyptic story told through the map, the point of view of the map. And then Dream Askew is another post-apocalyptic game about community, but instead it's very much focused on people and their relationships, and what it's like to have differences of power and types of power within a really small community. So that's just a bit of background on who I am. So I'm going to talk about sincerity in play. And I wanted to put up this slide because a lot of the time when people talk about RPGs and theory, big jargon wars emerge, and people get really, really, really attached to the definitions that are being thrown around. I'm super not attached to any of the definitions I'm going to be throwing around, and I haven't put as much thought into them as would be required for me to, write the textbook with all the terms defined in the sidebar. So these are ideas. And when I talk about sincerity and I give a working definition of sincerity, it's just an idea. It's not a piece of jargon. I really hope that sincere play versus non-sincere play never becomes a forum thread anywhere. Yeah, there's ideas to hold lightly too and toss around and think about together. Okay, so there's lots of different types of fun that you can get out of role-playing games. There's not one type that is right. There's not one type that is superior, that is the one sure way. So I'm talking about sincere emotional play as one opportunity, kind of among many, among a bouquet of opportunities for play. Why do I find it exciting as a focus and a pursuit in game? The first reason is I think there's a big rush that you can get from sitting down to a table, trusting the people there, and having that trust rewarded. By sitting down and becoming vulnerable and having others become vulnerable and lift each other up in that state. The reward doesn't quite work if you show up and trust other people and then they break that trust. It doesn't really work if you show up and become vulnerable and then other people take advantage of that vulnerability. So I'm going to be talking about some of the ways of avoiding those pitfalls. But sincere emotional play, when it works, is exciting because we all, from a safe space that we make together, can kind of surprise ourselves and challenge ourselves and go new places and learn new things about ourselves and explore fraught terrain together. I think story games have this amazing potential to give us an opportunity to practice being better humans in situations that we haven't been in yet. Yeah, that's super powerful. So I have started using the word sincerity in a bunch of sentences over and over and over again already. And so I want to talk about what I think that word means in this context. So when I talk about sincere emotional play, I mean play where we allow ourselves to explore fraught terrain. And by that I mean terrain or like kind of stories and playing characters who, you know, we're a bit anxious about approaching, where we're like, I think this is a really good idea to tell a story about. Or maybe it's going to be a train wreck, and maybe we're going to need to put it away and play Carcassonne for the last hour instead. But I think it's a good idea. So that's what I mean when I say fraught terrain. So play where we allow ourselves to explore fraught terrain and feel whatever we end up feeling. Perhaps anticipated, but not orchestrated. Yeah. And what I mean by that last part, to explain by way of kind of a story, there was a convention that I went to, Big Bad Con in Oakland, if ever you're in Oakland in October, go to it. But after the convention, we were gathered and we were having, you know, junk food at a Denny's or some like last resort option for having everyone seated together. And we were talking about all of our play experiences. And I told a story about a game that we played that was really raw and that was really challenging, and it was like a really subtle, nuanced story that, like, at one point the table just kind of imploded in tears, which isn't necessarily the only thing I'm talking about when I'm talking about these games, but like definitely is like, that's a thing that can happen. And so yeah, I talked about this game where all of a sudden it was just like, boom, it hit us. We kind of, the table broke down for a little while, and it was like a really powerful game. And then the GM sitting next to me was like, oh yeah, I had this scenario I ran. My goal was to make everyone cry by the end of the session, and it totally worked. And he was like, there's like a moment of like where he was like trying to like establish some camaraderie, and I was like, ooh, no, no, not that at all. Which is why I'm distinguishing between trying to orchestrate emotional responses that you get out of people versus going into a situation knowing you might feel something. So that's what I mean when I say sincerity. So when we try to create games, or when we try to play games, I'm not making a lot of distinction here between play and design because they're kind of the same thing. When we go in looking for like sincere, cathartic emotional experiences, there are a bunch of common missteps or common screw-ups that happen along the way. The first is that we put an emphasis on performing emotion rather than experiencing it. So rather than giving ourselves space within the telling of the story, within the water breaks between the telling of the story, to actually process our emotions, to work through them, to give our characters quiet moments to like see how these repercussions have played out, we instead focus on creating this grand display of anger or this grand display of sadness and sorrow and putting our emotions out here rather than allowing them to stay in here a little bit more. If that distinction makes sense. So that's a common misstep along the way, is focusing on proving through soliloquy and grand action and melodrama our emotions rather than just letting them exist alongside the game. The second common misstep, especially in game design, is to create games that are like, all right, this is the part where you feel sadness. You know, you rolled a 7, your character feels sad, emote sadness, so go. And unless, like, incidentally that person happens to feel sad in that moment, it's not going to be sincere. By its very nature, it's not going to be. So, 2 common missteps along the way. There's this idea called the fruitful void. Have people heard of the fruitful void before? Like, a couple people, cool. So that's a theory idea first introduced by Ron Edwards, later kind of explained and explored further by Vincent Baker. And the idea of the fruitful void is that your game is about whatever the mechanics point in the direction of, have you constantly thinking about, and never give you any answers to. So your mechanics are kind of like scaffolding, or they're kind of like walls of a house, and the fruitful void is that nebulous gray area. The mechanics are like, oh yeah, think about that more. Think about that more. I'm not going to help you think about it. I'm just going to I'm going to ask you constantly in subtle little ways to think about it. An example is in the game Dogs in the Vineyard. Dogs in the Vineyard, for anyone who hasn't played it, go play it. It's a game about being agents of faith in early kind of settler colonial Wild West. Your agents of faith, you have your holy book, you have your badass coat that your neighborhood is sewn for you, and you have your gun. You're 19, you have no life experience, you're asked to go deliver the mail town to town, perform wedding and funeral rites town to town, and root out sin and solve injustice for communities that you've probably never been to. So it's a game about being asked to do something that you can't reasonably be asked to do, and to have utter and total faith in what you're doing. The mechanics of the game, there is no faith to that. There is no point at which the mechanics ask you whether you still believe in the work you do. There's rules about combat, there's rules about how badass your gun is, about how badass your coat is, about how badass your holy book is. There's rules about how hierarchies of sin occur within towns. There's rules about how you might root out the mysteries and the sins going on. But there's never a point where the mechanics actually give you a way to say, oh yes, it turns out I still have faith. That's something that you have to grapple with throughout play. And that's what the Fruitful Void of Dogs in the Vineyard is, and it's what makes Dogs in the Vineyard interesting. It's what makes it not just a game about cowboys with guns, coats, and books. It's a game about grappling with your faith. When we look for sincere emotional play, we need to recognize that those emotions are going to sit within that fruitful void. That if we want to play games that are meaningful and challenging to us and to our hearts, that we need to look inside ourselves rather than look inside of the textbooks for the answers, or for the kind of the structure of that. So there's another tendency we have when we are looking for sincere emotional play, when we're like, let's explore some like deep, moving, cathartic experiences. For some reason, we confuse ourselves along the way, and we're like, great, what that means is like we need as much sex, as much murder, and as much betrayal as possible in as short a time frame as possible. And we have a tendency, and by we I mean me and everyone it turns out I've played with, probably you as well though. We have a tendency to equate things that are emotionally significant with things that are emotionally extreme. I think it's a false equivalency. I'm not sure what in the human brain makes that connection, but we have a tendency to move towards hit harder play whenever we want to engage with emotional play. There was, in 2006, a kind of a manifesto or a credo written by Tony Lauerbosch. It was called the Moi Macho Credo, and it was an approach to role-playing games, and it was, I believe, written really tongue-in-cheek. I say believe because I'm still not entirely sure, but it was explaining how to play games that are all about being there to receive emotional trial, and to be there to prove your emotional fortitude that you could take whatever the story threw at you. And the point of play was to throw things at the other players who are also moi macho. And I want to establish that as, I think, in almost all cases, different than approaching a game looking to actually feel something. I don't think the moi macho or the hit harder or the blood in the water kind of play leads very effectively to sincerely feeling the emotions that you want to get out of a game. They tend to be orchestrated displays of emotional fortitude rather than kind of sincere emotional explorations. So I'm going to talk about two of my games. I'm going to talk about one of the games that I'm still really proud of, and one of the games that I'm like kind of embarrassed about now. The one I'm kind of embarrassed about is Perfect Unrevised. It's a game about being in like this steampunk dystopian world where your every movement is kind of tracked and regulated, and caring about something enough to go out and commit crimes and potentially be tracked down by inspectors and fixed. And I wrote Perfect because I wanted to, it was originally published in 2006, a revised version called Perfect Unrevised was published in 2011. My goal with this was to create a game where you got to explore what it meant to actually really believe in something, like enough to risk your life and enough to risk the fact that you might be locked down and brainwashed. So you're putting your emotions on the line because you care that much about them. But the way the game is structured, the way that plot is structured and the mechanics work, is that if you actually did believe in what you were doing and believe in your character's mission, and if you related to your character, and if you felt that emotional bleed of like, yes, this matters to me, then the game punished you. The game was about punishing you for the degree to which you sincerely felt what the game was telling you to feel. So that's kind of like a hit harder design that, I now feel foolish about. So that's an example of one of the ways I think that we kind of set ourselves up for failure in looking for sincerity in play is by equating that with emotional extremity, dictating where the emotions should be, punishing people for feeling them when they actually feel them.
Do you have any repercussions from that sort of a cycle?
Yeah, repercussions like how?
Like, do you get a lot of negative feedback from players, or like, did they not notice that they were being punished for their emotional stance? Or?
No, I don't. So the question, just for the camera, in case it didn't catch it, was were there negative repercussions of that game design? And were there people who kind of felt hurt or who felt triggered maybe by that content or by that structure of story? The answer is I didn't hear about it, but also when people are burned by a game, the person running the game or the person designing the game doesn't hear about it. So hopefully not, and I think not. But the two things that it did, the two side effects that it produced reliably are, first, I didn't get the experience that I wanted out of playing, and a lot of people didn't get the experience they wanted out of playing. They got this other experience where they got to be like super tough, badass Batmans, and they got to like withstand all of the emotional trial. But we didn't get the chance to actually be people who cared about something. And who fought for that thing that they cared about. It was instead about moi macho Batmanism. The other thing that happened is, so at first, the people who were really excited about Perfect, and when they gave the pitch, who like bought the book or like who were like ooh, there was a really even gender split. There's a really just like demographic wise, it seemed like like a pretty random sample of people were excited about that pitch. The people who actually played more than one session were all straight white men who hadn't experienced a lot of oppression in their real lives. And I was more excited about playing with that random demographic than I was straight white men exclusively who have never experienced a lot of oppression. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that was good.
Cool. Okay, so I've talked about like how not to approach sincere emotional play. In that case, how do we do it? My advice is to provide that fraught context through the mechanics, through the setting, through the scenario you set up as the GM, through the way you establish trust when you sit down. Establish kind of a narrative context and a storytelling context that's fraught. It's full of situations that could go awry, situations that could lead to a lot of in-game hurt or scariness or anger or joy or redemption. To set up those stories and those possibilities and then explore them together without having preordained ideas in your mind about what the emotional arc of the story is going to be. So if you sit down and you're like, okay, we're going to have like some sad times, and then they're going to kill a villain, so then like happy times, but then like the villain's brother is going to kill, so like sad times again, then the emotional responses you get in play aren't going to be very sincere. Instead, if you sat down and like, there's a lot of possibility for happiness and a lot of possibility for sadness here, I have no idea where this is going to go. And you sit down with that kind of mentality and setup, and you just trust that people will engage to the degree that they're comfortable and excited in engaging with that, that you get lots of really rewarding emotional play. The as deeply as they're comfortable part, I think, is really key. I think that a lot of times when we sit down to games, some people are really excited about playing, some like a scenario and having it be like really cathartic and fraught, and we we try and push everyone to get onto that same page of like, okay, let's really mourn this tragic situation. Like everyone else is doing it, you got to do it. If we push players to get to the same level of vulnerability, they're not necessarily going to be comfortable. They might tune out. We might lose them as people who are invested in the outcomes of the story and invested in the emotional space of the story. So we want to invite discovery, make space for the unexpected, rather than trying to force a certain emotional response or just force emotional response generally. One of the ways that I've been thinking a lot about game design lately is to be thinking about pivot points, either in a story or in a game's mechanics or in a scene, the points where the game suddenly kind of swings and goes off in a new direction. And so in a game like Dungeons & Dragons, in a game like an adventure game, that tends to be the moment of heroic success and the moment of heroic action. You kill the dragon, or you flee, or whatever the case might be, and suddenly the story is going in a new direction. And the emotional tenor changes almost immediately. I think we have lots of models for games that pivot on success, both mechanical and narrative success. We don't have a lot of models for games that pivot on player experiences. So the game that I'm going to talk about of mine that I'm really proud of is Ribbon Drive. I have copies of it available if anyone wanted to buy it later. Ribbon Drive is a game about a group of people getting in a car, going on a road trip together. They're all full of life expectations. They know what the future's got in store for them, or they hope that the future has something particular in store for them. The game is soundtracked to mixtapes that everyone makes beforehand. So everyone, I make a themed mixtape that's all about revenge, and it's just like all like emo power ballads, and you just like made this like twangy, folky country mix called Yesterday's Lovers, and it's like kind of a bit like a weird hipster breakdown in the middle of the thing, and you made another mixtape. We shuffle them up, we listen to one at random, and we listen to the first few songs in silence, and that gives us our starting situation for our road trip. So we listen to that first song, and we're like, okay, what are we doing then? We're in this car together, where are we going? And based on this track, we decide we're going to a funeral, or we're going to a high school reunion, or we're all moving to Chicago and we met each other on Craigslist. Whatever the case might be. The driving mechanic of the game, other than listen to mixtapes and then say what happens next on your road trip, is futures. Everyone has two futures. The things that you believe or anticipate are going to happen for you, either in the short or the long term, and maybe they'll happen along the road trip. And if that's the case, that's really cool. That also means you're not the protagonist. Maybe you'll give up on one of your futures. You'll be like, you know what? I'm not going back to college to get my master's, or like, I'm not returning to Detroit to pick up Susanna. Like, that we're done. And every time you just let go of one of those futures, you cross it off. And if you cross both off, that means you're the protagonist. Then the game wraps up really quickly. So it's a game about just like learning to let go and learning to like accept what comes your way. Which incidentally is what every road movie is about, pretty sure. The really interesting thing about the mechanic that I see in play is like usually when people cross off that either their first or their second future, like there's no soliloquy, there's no like announcing of the decision. There's the player might not even have said anything in that scene, but like everyone's like yeah, that's like they watch that line being crossed out, and there's like nodding around the room. And rather than being about a moment of emotional performance, it's about the fact that the player and character are finally on the same page about this just doesn't matter anymore. This future. So that's an example of game mechanics pivoting on emotional experiences rather than on specific actions. Also related to Ribbon Drive, I want to talk about kind of down-tempo play, or quiet play, or slow play. Or you could probably come up with other words for that too. I think we have a cultural obsession with stories about uninterrupted rising action that reaches a certain climax and then quickly wraps up. We're so attached to that type of story that when you go to an English class, you are taught that that's what a story is. And it's cool. It's cool to, to have a car chase and an explosion, and then later on, a car chase and an explosion at the same time, and then like more and more bullets being shot in every scene, and everyone dies. That's a fine story. I like that story sometimes. But there's also something magical about letting the little details of a life matter, of telling stories about having your tea in the morning, reading your paper, saying a few words with your lover, going out, having something awful happen or something great happen, whatever the case might be, and the next day being right back there, having tea, reading over the paper, a few words with your lover. There's something exciting about staying in that early part of a story where you're like, there's so much possibility for this person. And when you were really attached to the rising action, big climax scene, that's a story that quickly loses possibility. Because, the more unnamed agents of a certain shadowy government agency are chasing you, like, pretty soon your only options are eyeball shooting. And you quickly hammer in who this person could be, what this person's secret strengths could be, what this person's emotional experiences of their day could be, and what we as players can connect to them about. Zen type of play is, I think, a possibility where it's like it's a space, or it's a style of play where it's a lot easier to leave room to feel things and to relate to your character and to have character bleed, which is a term meaning just feeling the same thing as your character is feeling, realizing that like something happened 5 minutes ago or 2 seconds ago, or suddenly their sadness is your sadness or their joy is your joy. That happens a lot more when we allow our stories to move slowly, to be nuanced, to approach action and then just back away from it. So Ribbon Jive, again, one of the ways that is encoded in the story is every scene is framed based on listening to the song that's playing at the time, giving it 20, 30 seconds, and then framing based on what you've heard. So player silence and just player contemplation is used as a scene framing mechanic. It's also used in scenes as a resource. If the three of us are playing Ribbon Jive and a scene starts and I say something and then you say something, that leaves Aaron as the only person who hasn't spoken in the scene yet. That gives him certain narrative rights in Ribbon Jive. It means he can introduce the obstacle and decide, and there's not an obstacle in every scene, but he can decide that the bridge is washed out, or we ran out of gas, or someone, the hitchhiker we picked up is choking and no one knows what to do. Whatever the obstacle that Aaron's excited about might be. So silence becomes a resource, and the game rewards you for just listening and just taking it in and just letting yourself experience the scene rather than feeling like you need to jump in and push it in a certain direction, especially push it towards action. I think part of what works with Ribbon Jive is that the first 2 songs to the start where you have to listen in silence, because it's really, really awkward, and you all want the game to work, and so you're all sitting there like awkward and nervous and excited about possibility, and not really sure exactly what to do with those 3 minutes. But that awkward, just like, okay, I'm gonna just be invested, hope this works, tends to pay off. So when we set out to play games that are emotionally impacting, I talked earlier about some pitfalls. I think one of the other pitfalls is that I, at least, have been working through, and I've seen a lot of other people kind of doing this. There's this impulse to okay, well, let's hit others with really emotionally triggering stuff, and that will definitely produce some emotions. And it's not orchestrated, so there's that, but yeah, sometimes we play games and we're looking for an emotional cathartic experience, and so someone just throws in murder, or throws in rape, or throws in genocide, because they expect an emotional rise out of people, and they're like, well, that's what we want, right? I think sincerity and having that sincere emotional play where you can experience something together is predicated on honesty and transparency. And by transparency, I don't mean that there can't be like secrets. The GM, if there is a GM, can have secrets. But these games and this style of play work better when we go in expecting similar things. And we go in understanding what the problematic content we might encounter might be, understanding what the triggering content that might be there is. And while obviously story games go off in directions we don't anticipate, and that's exciting and that's good, sitting down together with like a similar understanding of like, here's what I think is on the horizon, is really helpful in making sure that you actually, or in letting you experience the sincere emotions and and making sure you don't hurt others along the way. One of the things that we do at the monthly story games meetup I go to in Vancouver, Terminal City Story Games, is that we, in pitching games, talk about what the game's like, how many players we need, and then we just introduce like problematic content that we might encounter. And for an example, one of the games that I wrote is a body horror game called Abnormal. And it's a game about someone kind of becoming very uncomfortable in their skin, because they're growing extra orifices, or they find their mouth moving and talking, and voices are coming out that aren't their voice, and they're like, I don't know what to do. And so when I pitched that game, I pitched problematic content, body horror, dysmorphia, dysphoria, and I also mentioned problematic sexual content. Because it's something that I see in a lot of the games, and one might not anticipate if they hadn't watched a lot of body horror movies, or they hadn't read the rules. It's something that comes up, and so it's important for people to know. And if they're excited about sitting down and playing this game still, that can be a really cool story. But if you sit someone down for a story and then throw problematic sexual content at them out of the blue, they're not going to come back, and they shouldn't, because you treated them really shitty. So, instead, we should build on consent and disclosure when we're pitching games, when we're structuring games, when we're talking about our games, and when we're designing scenarios. So, Love Nothing is a game by Jackson Tegu. It's not available, so sorry about that. But several of his other games are, and you should definitely go get a hold of them because they're all brilliant. But Love Nothing was a game that I played at Big Bad Con, which I mentioned earlier. A lot of my amazing games and terrible game stories come from Big Bad Con. But when we sat down to play Love Nothing, and he's super secretive about it, so I'm not going to tell you anything about it other than its name. Sorry. But when we sat down at the table, we were creating our characters, and one of the players writes something down and stares at it for like a long time, and then he like goes to erase it, and he's like, no, I can't do that. I would lose it. I would burst into tears. It was like an issue that was really close to his own heart, their own heart. And the rest of the table were like, well, we kind of know each other, and it's dinner after this, so we can go, decompress and unpack and have a drink or have a burger together or whatever. So, not saying you have to, but if you want to rewrite that, you can go ahead and, we'll go down that road with you. And they thought about it for a while, and they're like, I don't know. It's really personal. And we're like, cool. Write the really personal thing if you want to. And they wrote it, and we played this game, and that was the game that I was talking about, which was like, this is just like a quiet, subtle story about some people's intertwining lives, and then all of a sudden hit that moment where it's like, boom. And yeah, the table broke down in tears, which definitely isn't a play experience everyone is excited about. But it was a play experience that I was like really excited about in that moment. We decided to play in fraught territory, and that was a thing that if that friend of mine had written that thing down and not told us about it, or told us about it and not told us that like, hey, this is like what what still hurts in my heart, in my real life, in my real heart. But it might have felt like really awful to get to that point where someone's just like, I can't deal with this anymore, and everyone else is like, we would have loved a heads up. And how but the fact that we put our emotional stakes on the table meant that it was a really rewarding play experience when it happened. I talked a second ago about kind of consent in how we approach fraught terrain in games. And I just wanted to also throw out the idea that the consent of players is impacted a lot by the dynamics of power around a table. So when you sit down with a group, if someone is the GM, they have a lot more social power in that situation, and people may be more likely to just kind of go along with whatever they say. And so like, we're going to play like a really intense game that's going to involve war and like brutalities of war. Someone else might be like, sure, I mean, it's your house. I'm eating your Cheetos. I guess we'll do that. And that can happen based on the roles that people are playing in the game, based on the experience levels that people have with role-playing games, based on real-world power differentials. It's something to think about, and it's something that when you play, recognize that consent to keep going with engaging in fraught emotional territory works on several levels. It works on saying, like the literal saying yes of like, I'm excited about playing this. It also works on reading people's body language and making sure that that aligns with the yes, I'm excited about playing this that you're hearing them vocalize. So in talking about tools to make sure that you have that being on the same page, actually having the power to consent to or back away from fraught emotional territory, one tool that I'm really excited about is the X card. It gets used a lot kind of in like the New York story game scene and in other places. Have people played games with using the X card? Cool. So some people. So the way that the X card works is really simple. You take a card, like an index card, you put an X on it, you put it in the little table. Or maybe if it's a big table, you make sure 3. And if ever there's a point in the story where we hit a type of content that you don't want there, because it's upsetting, because it's problematic, because someone used the name Catherine and that's your mother's name and you just don't want your mom's name in the story, like it can be a big thing or a little thing. You can just tap that X card or hold it up or say, I X that. Whatever feels most comfortable in that moment, and we just back up and we figure out how to make sure the story stays fun for everyone. So I am super terrified of spiders. People are super excited about putting spiders into games all the time. That's what I use the X card for most often. And so, if we're playing in the quiet year, it's this post-apocalyptic wasteland, and someone's like, and there's this like big mutant spider, and I'm like, no. And they're like, okay, well, there's this big mutant leopard. Cool. The X card can work for things like that. It can also work for difficult emotional territory. It can work for talking about whether you're going to put something like problematic sexual content, whether you're going to put murder, or whether you're going to put any other potentially triggering content in there. If you have the X card, it's one extra tool for people to say like, no, we're going to back away from that. We're going to go in a different direction. It's really exciting. If you're playing games that are potentially fraught, if you're playing games that are potentially going to leave people relating really hard to their characters and feeling what they feel, putting an X card on the table is super amazing. It takes like a few seconds to explain. Final slide.